everyone, welcome. On behalf of the Center for Social Justice, I'm Jill Irvine, and I'm the Director of Women's and Gender Studies and the Co-Director of the Center for Social Justice. And so we would very much like to welcome you here today in what is a series of events related to the recipients of the 2014 Clyde Snow Award. Just before we begin, in case some of you don't know the center or have not been to a Center for Social Justice event yet, I'd like to say a few words about that. It's an initiative of the Women's and Gender Studies program established in 2008, which promotes justice, equality, and human rights through local and global engagement. And the center runs a number of different programs, including an activist in residence program, a social justice minor. For those of you who are interested in social justice questions, please think about the minor. There are lots of great things that you can do with the minor. A graduate fellows program. Some of you may have attended some events that are related to our latest program, which is the Race Card Project, and some of you may have been at the Michael Brown event last week, and then you know a little bit about that program. We have lots and lots of events on campus, and this is only one in a series, and so I have to plug, in case you want to do a double header today, a couple of events that we are co-sponsoring tonight. The first one is on human rights in the garment industry, a talk with workers from the Alta Gracia factory in the Dominican Republic, and that's at 7 o'clock in Dale Hall Tower. And the second event that we're co-sponsoring tonight is the Cherokee Word for Water, and that is a screening of a film on Wilma Mankiller, who is the first woman to become chief of the Cherokee Nation. And she will, her husband, actually, Charlie Soap, who is the director of the film, as well as many of the people who are featured in the film, will be there afterwards for a question and answer session. So just to let you know about those two events. If you're interested in this center, please check us out at csj@ou.edu. And there's also a sheet that will be going around at this event today. Please sign up if you'd like to get information about our programs and our events. It's my great pleasure to do the first introduction, the first pass, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Misha Klein, to introduce our guests today. And they are, as I mentioned, here to receive the Clyde Snow Award, Social Justice Award this year, which was established by the Center in 2012 to honor the work of the late Clyde Snow, his pioneering work in human rights forensics. And the award seeks to recognize those who are working to rehumanize those victims and survivors of human rights abuses. Our award winners this year are the women that you see in the back. Can you wave? Yeah. Who are from the Association of Relatives of Executed and Missing Political Prisoners of Calama. And you'll hear more from them today. They've traveled here from one of the driest places on earth, the desert of northern Chile, to share their story of loss and determination in the face of repression and state-sponsored violence after the coup of 1973 in Chile. Joining them is also a social documentary photographer, Paula Allen, whose work has been published in the New York Times, the Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, the London Sunday Times, and many, many other places. And really is just wonderful, wonderful work. If you have a chance to look at her work, I strongly encourage that. Her 2013 book, Flowers in the Desert, tells the story of the women who are here, joining us here and being honored here these next 2 days. I'd like to point out that her book is on sale outside, and she will be signing copies of it after the talk today, so please stop by if you're interested in purchasing a copy. And finally, a few thanks and a couple of words about logistics before we begin. A big thanks to our co-sponsors in these series of events, the Center for the Americas and the College of International Studies, as well as the Gaylord College of Journalism, which allowed us to use their wonderful, wonderful room today. We appreciate their financial and logistical support. Second, a big thank you to the members of the Clyde Snow Social Justice Award Committee who've really worked tirelessly, you can tell how tired I am, tirelessly, to bring Paula Allen and the women from Chile here to campus. And I'd like to mention their names. It's Misha Klein. Misha's here in the front. Leslie Rankin-Hill. Leslie, you want to give a wave? And Clemencia Rodriguez. I don't think Clemencia is here yet. Thanks also to Jerry Snow, who got sort of made an honorary member of the committee and got saddled with a lot of work too. I think you will feel as inspired by the women from Kalama as we were on the committee when we saw the wonderful work they had done and are continuing to do. And finally, a big thank you to a Center for Social Justice Program Coordinator, Mallory Gladstein, and WGS Outreach Coordinator, Susie Jorgensen, for their work. So thank you, Mallory and Susie. Just a quick word about translation. There will be translators speaking. When we finish when Paula Allen brings her remarks to a close, we will then have the women join us up on stage for questions and answers. Please just be mindful of the slower process of translation as the translators are speaking to them and translating your questions. And finally, the stream team is here streaming this event today for the women's families at home who will be watching. So thank you all for being here, and I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Misha Klein.
Good afternoon, everyone. This has really been a labor of love and has involved an awful lot of people, some of whom are not able to be here because they have classes, and sometimes there are people who were working in other places, including another member of the team, Eric Stover, who is the director of the Center for Human Rights at UC Berkeley, who was also a member of the team, and of course, the committee. Of course, another member of the committee who, very sadly, is not with us. It was Dr. Clyde Snow himself. He was instrumental in selecting this year's nominees, and sadly is not able to be here to receive them with us. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about who Dr. Snow was and why we have created an award in his name. He was a forensic anthropologist. He worked on cases across the United States on everything from aviation accidents to serial killer, identification of victims of serial killers, to the Oklahoma City memorial bombing. Memorial came afterwards, excuse me. The Oklahoma City Federal Building bombing. And it was really closer to retirement that he became much more dedicated to the work of human rights. That is the work that we're honoring him for. He was, in using the forensic skills that he had, he actually developed other skills that were used specifically for these human rights purposes, but he brought a kind of a sensibility that is beyond the very specific and technical scientific knowledge that he had. He said that bones could tell stories, and rather than represent the tragedies that he was trying to explicate across the world, rather than representing them in terms of numbers, 100 people here, 1,000 people there, several hundred people there, we all tend to lose the sense of what that means. He actually would pick individuals, and he would tell their stories, and he would talk about the way in which, from their bones, he could tell information about who they were and how they had lived and how they had died in very specific ways that was critical to some very successful prosecutions of the perpetrators of these crimes against humanity, and will still be useful for years to come. This is a process that is ongoing. So he trained young scholars to do this kind of work. He established an Argentine team, and there are teams in El Salvador and Guatemala. He worked in Kosovo. He worked in Kurdistan and Ethiopia and many other places where there have been crimes against humanity, to identify the remains of people who were victims of human rights abuses. He worked to tell their stories, to try to seek justice, to bring the perpetrators to justice, and ultimately to bring solace to the families of people who lost their loved ones. As I said, sadly, we lost him in May of this year, but the impact of his work was global, and the obituaries that you can find on the Center for Social Justice website attest to that. If you're interested in finding out more about his work, our website has obituaries from the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, papers from outside of the country. So when we established the award, the first award went to him, and this is the first time that we're giving the award to someone else. And when we established the award, this idea of rehumanizing and making apparent the ways in which these victims were people with families and lives that were lost, that's what we were looking for. And that is why, as a group, we decided to honor this group of women who have been working for 41 years to try to bring justice for their loved ones who were taken from them. We're celebrating them in many ways for the incredibly empowering and inspiring story. But I'm very aware as well as the immense emotion that they bring to this, because this is a process of grief that never ends. Without justice, there can never be resolution. And you will get to hear from them after we hear from our first speaker, who is Paula Allen, the social documentary photographer. The reason that we're having Paula Allen speak is that she has a long working relationship with these women. She has been going to the Atacama Desert, to Calama, the city in the north of Chile's desert, since 1989, and has been working with these women. This group now includes 3 generations of family members from this particular town, and she has documented their stories in word and in picture. She's produced this book, which is now in its 2nd edition, and she's going to be sharing with you some of these photographs and explaining the story to you. After she finishes, then we will bring the women up, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and hear from them directly. Ms. Allen's work has taken her from around the globe to everywhere imaginable, from nonviolent revolutions to war zones, and from protesters' encampments to refugee camps. And she's worked for decades to draw the world's attention to violence against women. Her work has taken her, as I said, as broadly as Afghanistan and Angola, the Congo, Poland, Russia, Haiti, Mexico, as well as post-Katrina New Orleans, just to name a few, and of course to Chile. And it was Ms. Allen who nominated the Agrupación, the women who are here today, who nominated them for this award. And so we're very pleased to be able to welcome her here to share her exquisite photographs and to help us understand the significance of their story and their powerful inspiration to fight for justice, not just for themselves and not just for Chile, but for all of us. Please welcome Paula Allen.
It's such an honor to be here with all of you tonight. And before we begin, I'd love to ask the women to stand up, and I'd like to introduce each of them. Violeta Berrios Aguila, Lorena Hoyos Munoz, Teresa Berrios Contreras, Maria Araya Tapia, Ana Yuen Perez. Presente. I did want to say something about before I begin, about the Dr. Clyde Snow Award and the process of applying for it. And that is that I really gave it a lot of thought about whether I wanted to apply for it for the women or not. Not because I thought they didn't deserve it, but because I thought they deserved it so much that in some ways it was unbearable to think that they may not get it. And everything's a chance. You take it and you apply for something, and if you don't get it, you go on. but I really felt in this case that if I applied, and it was an extensive application process, that they had to get it. So here we are. And so the work and their efforts really made this happen. But I was reading over part of my application today, and I found this quote by Dr. Snow that is really why I ended up deciding to do this. And I read, suddenly when I started really learning more about Dr. Snow, I read everything I could find, of course. And I read the book, Witness from the Grave. And he explains in the book that out of all kinds of state violence against its own citizens, the most monstrous is what you do against your own citizens. That's the most monstrous kind of violence. And he said, as a motive, the state has no peers, for it will kill its victim for a careless word, a fleeting thought, or even a poem. And I thought, this is exactly what happened to the men in Kalama, and that I would definitely have to apply for this. So I thank Dr. Snow. Great sadness that we are here and won't be able to meet him, in great sadness and understanding and compassion, all of you who knew him so well. Thank you, everyone who made it possible for myself and everyone to be here. "25 years ago, on Christmas Day, 1989, I walked into the Atacama Desert in northern Chile for the first time with the women of Calama. 6 of us moved slowly across the barren expanse with shovels and plastic bags. A week before, I'd been in my home in New York City, preparing for an assignment in Santiago, without ever knowing there was a place in the world called Calama. A friend had called and said, I have just seen a film about women in Chile called The Dance of Hope. It was by filmmaker Deborah Schaefer, and I think you should see it. I did, and I was strongly moved by one story in particular. In this far northern desert town, a group of women whose fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons had been disappeared in 1973 into an unknown desert grave had been searching for years for their remains. Every year on October 19th, the anniversary of their loved ones' disappearances, the women threw flowers into the air, blanketing the sand with hundreds of red carnations. Hearing this, I was deeply moved. As a photographer committed to recording the hidden struggles of women all over the world, I knew I needed to be there. After finishing my work in Santiago, I boarded the bus for the grueling 26-hour ride into the driest region on Earth. With only a letter of introduction from the filmmaker Deborah Schaefer to Violeta Barrios, the president of the Women's Association, I arrived at Calama and made my way across the plaza in search of her. Although she was not expecting me, she gave me a warm welcome and introduced me to other women. For hours, they described their lives to me, and the urgency of their stories confirmed my commitment to them. This is what had happened in Chile. On September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet, with the backing of the United States government, overthrew the democratically elected Marxist government of Salvador Allende. Thousands of Chileans began to disappear, never to be seen again. At the end of September, a group of soldiers set out to the north of Chile in a military helicopter. This mission came to be called La Caravana de Muerte, the Caravan of Death. The caravan landed in 4 cities, where 72 people suspected of committing subversive activities were killed. On October 19, 1973, the caravan made its final stop in Calama, where 26 men were presumably executed and buried in a secret desert grave. During the first years after the disappearances, many of the wives, mothers, and sisters of the men met secretly. Frustrated by official unwillingness to provide the truth about their relative's fate, the women set out into the desert with their shovels to find the mass grave of their loved one. This is their story. I'm supposed to do it. I'm sorry. I didn't make you get up.
I forgot to tell you how to do it.
I didn't, sorry.
It's on me.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Kalama. Señora Leonela Rivas Ruiz, mother of Manuel Hidalgo Rivas, executed and disappeared at age 23, worker at the Rio Loa DuPont explosive factory. Brunilda Rodriguez, wife of Bernardino Cayo Cayo, executed and disappeared at age 43, employee and board member at the Rio Loa DuPont explosives factory. Victoria Saavedra Gonzalez, sister of Jose Saavedra Gonzalez, executed and disappeared at age 18, high school student. Violeta Berrios Aguila, partner of Mario Arguelles Toro, executed and disappeared at age 34, taxi driver. Hilda Munoz Rivera and Rolando and Lorena, wife and children of Rolando Hoyos Salazar, executed and disappeared at age 38, mechanic at the Rio Loa DuPont explosives factory. Ruth Maita Rios and Monica, wife and daughter of Milton Munoz Munoz, executed and disappeared at age 33, worker at the Rio Loa DuPont explosives factory. If you could tell, a number of the men worked at the explosives factory, and one of the reasons they were arrested, the reasoning was they were going to try to blow up the plant and therefore blow up all of Calama, which obviously was not the truth. Investigating the 26 victims of the caravan of death, a photograph of Jose, the youngest victim, is on the television screen. This is actually the first pictures when I arrived for the first time and went to the house of Violeta, and I went into the desert with a group of women, and this was taken on Christmas Day, 1989. This is a quote from one of the people who contributed to the book, which is the writer Ariel Dorfman. Behind the plan of exterminating those innocent men whose only sin was to have supported the legitimate president of Chile, behind the plan of sequestering their bodies so that no one could find their remains, there was the presumption that the desert would be a place of silence, that the desert was too vast and foreboding to ever yield its secrets. There was a certainty that the desert would be barren, quiet, as dead as the men who had been murdered. Those who committed these crimes were wrong. The women in these photographs prove them to be wrong. Violeta. We formed a kind of an information chain together. One friend contacted a friend who then contacted another friend who was in the military. We went to the place he told us about. He assured us it was where our men were buried. The impression was that we were finally going to a place that was certain. There was fear and anguish, fear of seeing how they had been killed. They told us they had not just been shot by a firing squad, but it had been a massacre. The bodies had been mutilated. We went 50 kilometers out of Kalama. There was nothing. Another deception, more disillusionment. Searching for bodies in the Valley of the Moon. So even me being there with the women in these occasions, I always think, how are we going to a place? How do we know where to go? There's 600 miles of Atacama Desert. How do the women know? And over the years, people would call and say, the men are buried here, the men are over there. And half of it obviously was lies, the majority of it was lies, but the women always had to go, because what if somebody was actually telling them the truth? Violetta searching in a cave. This photograph happened to Vicky because she simply called me one morning when I was there in Kalama, and she said, I had a dream last night, and I have an idea where they are. And I'll never forget this, because I literally, if I had turned around and lost Vicky, I would have been lost forever. But the women understand the desert. They understand what to look for. If there's a rock, if there's something, they know what to look for. And so we're running out into the desert, and I'm chasing after Vicky, and she fell to her knees at the spot and started digging with a plastic shovel. And she says, you know, we need to look for anything, for any sign, because they could be anywhere, because there is always the feeling that one must search for something. This is La Agrupación. And I learned something today because the women spoke earlier today that Lorena said. And there's an explanation that the group began when, after the women didn't know each other, and after they didn't know where the bodies were, they gathered together to go to the governor's office. And they said, where are our men? And the governor said he didn't know. And then the women were told, oh, the bodies would be returned in a year. There were health issues. And then there were lies, and all the women would say, that's when the lies began. So the women met clandestinely for many years in Violetta's house, which is here, because the risk they were taking was enormous. It was a dictatorship for all of these years. Pinochet was still in power. And today Lorena said the group formed together because of pain, because of el dolor. In 1990, Patricio Aylwin became president of Chile, and the women were able more boldly to march through the town and take more risks. And this is one of the first marches through the town, and the sign says, there was no war, because they always said, the government always said, oh, there was a war, and everyone would say, they said that to justify their lies, but what war? So there wasn't a war, it was a massacre. And the name of Agrupación. The first public action that the women did in the stadium in Kalama, placing 26 candles in front of 26 empty chairs. This is Maria Sepulveda and her mother-in-law, Grimilda Sanchez, at the Mass in memory of the executed men. Grimilda's son, Maria's husband, and Grimilda's husband were executed and disappeared. Lydia Olivares Araya and friends of the Agrupación during a vigil in the plaza of Calama. Juana Cepeda Fuentes with a photograph of her husband, Manuel, who is Señor Leonila's son. I had arrived to Calama in '89 for Christmas, and a mass grave was found in 1990 in June, and the women had been searching for 17 years for a mass grave. And this is what happened when they arrived to the grave. The sign says that Gramilda is putting in the desert the grave of the men shot by a firing squad, October 10th, 1973, by the Caravan of Death. Sergio Ariano Stark was the criminal, the assassin, who was the head of the mission, but of course the government of Chile, under the leadership of Pinochet, was the beginning, where the assassinations began. Violeta. It was on July 1990, we learned the location of the mass grave. We had only been 2 kilometers away from the site a few months before. I was very affected when I arrived there. I felt rage and impotence that during 17 years of searching, I hadn't found it before. Vicky. The grave was only 15 kilometers from Calama. We were amazed that they would bury them only 500 meters from the road. Violeta and I arrived to the site before they closed it off, and lying on top of the earth were pieces of skulls, pieces of ribs, and jaws. Some parts of the ground were soft, and as you stepped down, little bones would pop out of the sand. Señora Leonila. When I arrived to the site, Violeta told me it was already closed off. I felt a tremendous nervous tension. I wanted to be in total silence. There was a lot of suffering from having to watch it from so far away. I had hoped that we would find whole bodies. I felt a kind of a happiness that I might see my son complete. Marching to the mass grave, it's the first time that the women had a grave site to march to. Rooney next to the cross that the women built out of stone, marking the grave site. When the women arrived to the grave and when the investigation began, what they found, what the women explain a little, is tiny fragments of bodies. So what happened? You know, the investigation took a very long time to determine. At first they thought the bodies had been dynamited, and over the years the information became clearer that in fact the military had become worried that the women were in fact close to finding the grave, because in Chile people weren't giving up the search. And they were finding, there were bodies found in a mine near Santiago in a place called Lonquén. Bodies were turning up. So the military returned with an excavating machine with big claws, and they dug up the men, and they ended up moving them in another grave at that point, and they crushed all the bodies. And what the women found were the remains. Was a cross that was built by the workers at Codelco mining company Kalam is located next to the world's largest open pit copper mine, which also was a reason one would well imagine why Pinochet sent a caravan of death to the north, is to spread fear throughout all of Chile and secure their interests in the mining industry. Lorena, and the family members at the grave. Lorena was president at the time of this photograph. Bernardita, the daughter of Bruni. Then, of course, began the process of identification. That time, this is 1990, 91, 92, we didn't have such sophisticated processes of identification. The nuclear DNA, which exists now, the mitochondrial DNA, and all of this didn't exist. And so the body's the identification process was through a kind of a superimposition of overlay of image and diagram of parts of the bodies. So the women would go in and say, oh, that looks like my husband's jaw, and they would compare dental records to what they found at the gravesite. It wasn't only the 26 men. There were other men in Calama that suffered terrible tragedies. Their families suffered terrible tragedies, and I'm going to speak of two right now. This is Felipa, and Felipa Contreras. And I'm going to read you what she says about finding her husband. I learned from the radio newspapers that a body had been found in La Tetera mine in December 1990. The owner had been exiled, and when he returned to Chile, he reopened the mine. The cadaver was so well preserved because of the cold and dryness in the mine shaft that they said the body had been there only a couple of years. So it couldn't be someone who disappeared in 1973. They cut off his hands and sent them to Santiago for identification. 7 months later, the body was identified as belonging to my husband, Luis Contreras Leon. Vicky and Violeta came to my house, and they said they had news for me that I had to be strong. I said, they found him, haven't they? And I started to cry. I went to identify him. It seemed like he had been dead only a short time, not 17 years. He had all his hair, but his eyes were missing. I felt so much anger. And the women they snuck into the morgue, and they photographed Luis. And they returned to the morgue again, and she said they returned 3 times to the morgue. In 1993, many of the remains were placed into a mausoleum that the women had raised the money to build. Prior to that, they had been in the coffin in the area where the family of Lorena. So Louis' body was placed into a coffin, and the remains were then put into the mausoleum. Maria Raya. Her husband, Ricardo, had been arrested at the end of September, and he was killed by the police on October 5th. His body was returned to his family, but his body was returned mutilated, hands were broken, he was shot, I believe, 22 times. And he was put quickly in a coffin because Police had forbidden Maria and her family to mourn, to hold a wake, to dress in black. So she accompanied the coffin to the mausoleum, and she opened it because she was never actually sure if it was her husband that had ended up in the coffin. And I remember Maria's here, and that she opened it and she said, "Sí, that's Ricardo." 61 bags containing some of the remains of the men were put into a communal coffin. And the coffin was placed into the new mausoleum. In 1995, 13 of the men were identified by the process that you saw earlier. This is Violeta. I went to Santiago on September 22nd, 1995, to see my brother-in-law, who was very ill. And I went to the medical examiner's office where Dr. Hernandez was now working to see if she had any news. I asked her, "Now do you know who's been identified?" She said, "Look, I'm terrible at saying these things, but Mario is here." I left and I walked for blocks and blocks. I got coffee and tried to be calm as possible, but I cried and I cried and cried. I took a bus, but it was the wrong one. I finally took a taxi and went home. It was something that I could not accept. I called Vicky and she asked me, Violeta, is Mario there?" And I said, "Yes, he is there." Rooney. In October, Dr. Hernandez came to Calama and called a meeting. She began to tell us very slowly and sadly the names of the men who'd been identified. We heard the names one by one. They were able to identify 13 of our men. Some of the women suffered nervous shocks. Maria Sepulveda, Sabina Coquillo, Lorena Hoyos, when they heard that their relatives had been identified. When the doctor finished the list and said there was nothing for me, I felt sick. Senora Leonilla had nothing, I had nothing. I wanted to go to sleep, so I would not know the time was passing. Some of the women received with resignation pieces of their loved ones. I consoled myself by thinking that if my husband wasn't there, maybe he could still be found whole. This is a point where I felt that I could publish a book about what had happened. I always thought that I would publish a book when the first group of remains were identified. That although we've always said that when it's a story without end, that okay, that would be enough of an ending for a book. So at this point, that's what happened. In 1999, I published The First Flowers in the Desert in Chile. And it was done really as an act of defiance. And it was done there with great intention. And it was printed there, and it did serve as a human rights document at that time. But of course, the story was without ending, and I returned to Calama. Fidelisa, the grandmother of Monica, who has since passed on. A number of these women have passed. This is the 30th year anniversary. Soledad Mamani Armeja y Eloisa Arnella Munoz, the daughter and the wife of Domingo Mamani Lopez, at the mass grave. This is Senor Leonilla, and this is about 3 weeks before she died. And I want to read something that Rolando wrote, who is he sent me this in the mail when she passed. Rolando is the brother of Lorena. My mother, Violetta, and I went to see Senora Leonilla the day before she died. Everyone was worried about her. I believe that in the final hours of life, all the suffering that had accumulated in the years since she lost her son bore down upon her. She was lying in bed and her tears flowed, and she was not listening to anyone. She only felt pain. The next day I saw her in her coffin with a picture of her son. The look on her face was very serene, very different from when she was alive. It's very hard to see a mother so aged and worn out, having struggled so much. She was one of the first women to search through the desert. Senora Leonilla, Violetta, and Brunilda were the foundation stone, the cement of the group. She meant many things to all of us. For me, she was the queen. Even when she could not walk, she would arrive in a wheelchair to the monument in the plaza dedicated to the men, and I would kneel before her and kiss her hands. Monument in the desert that the women and family members built surrounding the cross, the center of the mass grave, 26 columns that marked each of the men. In 2008, a report was finalized. An investigation that had been ongoing for 5 years by Patricio Garcia, a private investigator who was hired by the government, and he traveled through Chile, he traveled through Latin America and through the United States, speaking to witnesses about what happened. The report, summarized in 2 lines, is that the men were removed from the first mass grave, they were put in another grave, they were put in another grave, and finally they were thrown into the sea. If you ask the women, and you can because they're here, if this is true, if they believe in the report, you would find doubt. And the reason for that doubt is something shared by many of them, is that they've never been told the truth. Everyone has always lied to them. These are military people who are involved in this. How do they trust any information that they receive? And it's coming from a report. It's not even coming from the perpetrators who are coming to the women and saying, I did this, we did this. That hasn't happened. So how do you really know what the truth is? After this, around the time, there was a movement in Chile that everyone, and in Latin America, that everyone, the dictators were getting nervous, that people were going to find the bodies, find the graves, and there would have to be accountability. So they began loading bodies in transport planes and throwing people into the sea. And in Chile, Pinochet named this operation the Retirar de los Televisores, which is a removal of the television sets. This is Vicky, who after the report came out, I went to the sea with her around the area where the men were presumably thrown into the sea. Soli and Violetta inside the monument on Valentine's Day. Montserrat, the daughter of Lorena, at the mass grave with a photograph of her grandfather, Rolando Hoyo Salazar. Belén Rodriguez Hidalgo, the great-granddaughter of Senor Leonilla, with her grandmother Juana. Monica's daughters, Giselle y Jocelyn. Jocelyn is now the same age as Monica was when I met her. The book, the part that you're looking at now after the picture of the shovel becomes a part of the new edition of the book. There are 3 new chapters. And the book is dedicated to the 3rd generation. The landscape has changed. The search really no longer takes place in the desert. It now takes place in courtrooms. These are the women who are arriving. This is in November 2011, and identifications of 10 of the men have arrived, and this is from DNA testing in Austria. So when I actually looked at this picture, I suddenly thought, okay, so at this point it's 38 years later, okay? 38. Women are now receiving 10 other identifications after 38 years. So I thought, the bones of their men have traveled from the grave to Kalama, to Santiago, to Bosnia, to Austria, back to Santiago, to Kalama. Because the DNA testing happened first in Santiago, then in Bosnia because of the International Center of Missing Persons there, and then a more sophisticated testing happened in Austria. So they're receiving the evidence reports of remains found identified in Austria, in Innsbruck. Families waiting for the information. This is in the center is Minister Solis, his assistant, and on the other side is Patricio Bustos, the director of Servicio Médico Legal, which is in Santiago, which is a coroner's office. And they're receiving this information in family court. Soledad receives the evidence report that her father, Domingo Mamani Lopez, was positively identified through pieces of his hand bone. The evidence report. Well, what happened, as it says, all the evidence, all of the findings dissolved in the DNA solution. So Soledad, as 2 other families, received a positive identification, but were given nothing to bury. At the time, the women were also presented with clothes, different objects that had been categorized and had been found at the mass grave site. Feliso Hopia Núñez, the niece of Roberto Rojas Alcayaga, examines pieces of clothes that were found at the mass grave. This is taking place the next day in the coroner's office. This is a positive identification. This is Lorena, who's here. A number of these women are receiving pieces of her father. And I'd like to read something that Lorena said to me with this picture. I have 2 fathers. I believe that all of us older children whose fathers were executed think the same way. We have the whole father we did 1,000 things with, and the destroyed father. It is a very harsh reality. What makes this worse is having lived like this our entire lives. They find a little piece of a nose or a tooth, and there is something to bury. And then another piece is found, and we wait for more information. As far as I'm concerned, they murdered him 5 times. First, when they shot him, he received 21 bullet wounds and 3 stab wounds. The second, when they buried him for the first time. The third, when they buried him again. The fourth, when they buried him yet again. And the fifth, when, if, they threw them into the sea. Brunilda and her daughter Bernardita receiving remains. This is Bernardita. I had prepared myself to not find anything, so the delivery of the remains caught me by surprise. I thought the process was finished. I needed it to be. I have never recuperated from the sadness of losing my father, and I was amazed at how close I felt to him when I saw pieces of him. I believe that my father is in parts. There is a genetic part that lives in my brother and me, a part of his spirit in his house, a part in the first grave, a part in the second grave, a part in the third grave, a part in the sea. And then there is a minuscule piece they gave back to us. In the end, he is spread over many places. Now I have something to bury. So maybe I can feel closure, but the absence of not having him exists forever in my life. The family of Senora Leonela receiving parts of her son Manuel. Senor Leo never knew that her son had been identified. She died before. The man holding the part is Senor Leo's husband, Hernan. So, we've talked about that in 1995 they identified remains. So those remains were put into individual small coffins, and they were put into the mausoleum. So the forensic specialists and the anthropologists went back with the women to the mausoleum, and they removed the small coffins in order to combine remains of families who had previously had identified remains with the new pieces that they found. The newly identified remains of Roberto Rojas Alcayaga, along with his remains and family mementos that were identified previously in 1995, are being prepared for another burial. I'm going to update this right here and continue for another minute, but I'd love the women to tell this because honestly, the information I'm going to share with you is new information for me. And that's the bones from 1995, the remains, were then removed after this, and they were sent to Austria for DNA testing. Because remember, they had all been identified, the bodies, through a very kind of, antiquated process in 1995. And so, tragically, or how to even talk about it, I'm not sure yet. For example, Vicky, who had pieces of her brother, Jose, identified in 1995, found out that none of the remains belonged to her brother. Lorena found that another family had remains of her father. So they can tell you the update on this, but this is 41 years later. I come to a close always with a photograph of Violeta. This was taken in 2011 because this is where I began. I began 25 years ago entering through this same gate into the house of Violeta. And the last few pictures we'll just look at together, and I was there last year for the 40th anniversary. I'm going to end reading something by Isabel Allende, the writer, who wrote an essay for the book. For a long time, the women of Calama looked for their disappeared. Now they are looking for the truth. For a long time, those brave women defied the brutality of the dictatorship. Now they defy the complicit silence of those who are attempting to erase the past as if it never happened. For the rest of their lives, they will defy those who want to forget. Jealously, they guard the memory of their dead. They are the voice that will pursue the murderers to the end of their days. In the desert sand, they are writing the true story of Chile, the truth that textbooks omit, that the press does not print, that governments hide, and that the military, unpunished and arrogant, denies. Those women do not wish for revenge. They seek justice, but they do not believe in it. They know that the guilty will never be punished. All they want is for the truth to come out, for their dead to be honored, for the bodies of the 3,000 disappeared to be returned, for the pain of their families to be respected, and for the past to be remembered, so that such horror may never be repeated. Reconciliation in Chile can take place only if it is founded on the truth. Truth is a vigorous plant with deep roots. The women of Calama, purified by their suffering, do not forget. They are our conscience. Solo puede haber reconciliación en Chile sobre las bases de la verdad. La verdad es una planta vigorosa y de raíces muy profundas. Esas mujeres de Calama, lavadas por el sufrimiento, no olvidan. Ellas son nuestra conciencia. Thank you. I just also wanted to share, it's the first time that I've shown these images in this way with the women present. And it's a beautiful experience to be doing this and also challenging to tell their stories. And now I'm very happy that they can talk with you.
We have a. We have a mic. We have a like a long mic, and then there's a thick 6 chairs.
Oh, okay. I'll stay standing. Oh, okay. Oh, that's okay. That's done. He's another translator. Yeah. And just in case I pass
share with them your experience of watching the light. You were able to turn the light. So you were able to turn the light when you hear each of them tell their personal stories, but some of you that have gotten to have that opportunity. And some of those general questions, some of you were at the lunch, but some of the other questions.
¿Hubo alguien que fue llevado a la justicia por todo lo que ocurrió? ¿Hubo algún proceso contra los militares o los carabineros? At this time, they are being processed, but there's nothing yet, so we're waiting. What would you tell people that are suffering or passing through the same process? We would tell others to keep the faith, to be strong, and to be united, as we were for 41 years. Oh, sí, las fotos que tienen allí, si nos pueden decir algo sobre ellas.
Bueno, nosotros llevamos estas fotos en todas las actividades que tenemos porque van con nosotros y es de recordarlo y hacerlos partícipes de las actividades.
We carry these photographs in every event we go, and it's a way of having them present with us as well. Yeah. It represents its own family. It's a way to remember their faces, their bodies, and not having only the bones from it. It's a way of reminding that we have a person in our family whose rights were violated. Yes. Okay. La pregunta es si han tenido ayuda de otros grupos dentro de Chile y si forman parte de algún proceso más general respecto de la situación de reconciliación en Chile. We're an independent organization. Before we were in touch or depending on the agrupación in Santiago. That doesn't mean that all the organizations would not think the same way about the situation. They do. We're self-sufficient financially.
Nos ayuda la municipalidad de Calama, algunos sindicatos de cobre, que le pedimos ayuda para hacer las actividades durante el día 19.
We get the help of the city hall or the municipality of Calama and some unions that will help us on the anniversary on the 19th of October. Mhm. It depends on the period. It depends on the time, but we have had the help of the municipality of Calama, the governor, the government at large, and the unions, the copper unions of workers in the region. But again, she wants to stress out it was not always the same. It varied through time. We're continuing now with the help of the municipality, the friends, and the unions right now. Yeah. Pregunta cómo ha sido la relación de ustedes con los distintos gobiernos que sucedieron a Pinochet en la transición.
Bueno, los gobiernos, por ejemplo, con Piñera, que era de derecha, no hubo relación, porque no se puede. Nosotros como una parte de la izquierda que estaba en los recuerdos y somos como esa piedra en el zapato que molesta, que molesta.
It varies, of course, with the last government of Piñera. Piñera was from the right, and so the relationship was very bad. And they are obviously from the left of the spectrum, the political spectrum, and she says we are like this little stone that's inside the shoe that's bothering you all the time when you walk. From everywhere from Lagos on, and including the government of Frey, uh, the process was, or the progress was very, very slow. So there really wasn't any, I guess, full support or response. When democracy came, we thought that we were going to have more answers or more cooperation. Yeah, the quest for truth and justice was uh, did not succeed. It's still there. Yeah.
Entonces las relaciones que han tenido relación o cooperación con otros grupos de madres en Latinoamérica, las madres de Guatemala, las abuelas, las madres de Uruguay, las madres de El Salvador, y todos otros países que han tenido guerras sucias,
Well,
que no se ayudan,
there,
que no se ayudan.
the question is if they have had any relationship with other mothers, organization of mothers, like the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, the mothers in Uruguay and the mothers in El Salvador, all places where the so-called dirty wars took place, and they basically corrected the dirty word name, and they said, well, dictatorship. It's straight away that qualification, not only dirty war. Unfortunately, we didn't have any relationship with the other organizations in Latin America. We're sad that that didn't happen, because we would like to share our story. We are at the end of the world, so far away from the capital, Santiago, so we're isolated. Not even in our own country we have any contacts with other organizations. In Santiago, there is the biggest they didn't even have good relationship with organizations that are close to Calama, which is Antofagasta. ¿Cuántos kilómetros? Like 300 kilometers from Calama. It's Antofagasta, and they are mentioning that the Antofagasta, they had little relationship with that organization, who was also divided a little bit into other organizations, and they're proud to say that they kept together. They never had any internal problems. Our organization is the only one that has everybody together, the families of the detained, the executed, the disappeared, and in other cases, those are organizations that are are apart from each other.
Es que hay muchas peleas por el poder, que a pesar que esto es tan pequeño, pero es una inmensa pelea por el poder. Y nosotros nos hemos mantenido gracias a que nos mantenemos bien como familia.
There is all those things happen, all those divisions happen because there is a sort of a little bit of a fight for power inside the organizations, and they are proud to say that that didn't happen in their case, that they kept united all the time for. Mm-hmm. No, go ahead. Now that we are here and that we're honored by you, we would like to start relationships with other organizations. This event for us, it's a way for everybody to know better what happened to us. Pregunta cómo es que ustedes saben cuál es, en quién confiar y cuándo lo que les dicen es la verdad o no.
Qué difícil contestar, porque a esta altura de todo el proceso, de todas las cosas que nos han sucedido, ya no estamos confiando en nosotros.
It's very hard to answer this question because after all the things that happened to us, we don't even trust ourselves. It's you're asking about trust in whether what they are told are lies or not. No hablaban de la confianza en sí mismo. When she said we don't trust ourselves, that means we don't have even faith in ourselves, not about believing in themselves. So my bad in the translation. Lo que pregunta es, ¿cómo saben ustedes quién les dice la verdad o no? Yo usé la palabra confiar, pero sí. We now trust a little bit more than we trusted an information before, and she mentions the case of the being given the bones or the small fragments of bones, telling them that this was theirs, and then it ended up not being the case. So that's kind of creates confusion. So, but it's the end. At the end, there is an improvement in the trust of the information they're giving. we currently do not actually trust uh, the morgue or the coroner office in Santiago, the medical examiner thing. Not would the Minister of Justice we don't trust, and that's the person who is in charge of their cause.
Eso es porque no ha sido un trato muy decoroso ni muy agradable entre ellos y nosotros. Y los trabajos últimos no han sido muy seguros.
It wasn't really a pleasant relationship, and the latest work that they have done, it was doubtful for them. What was the meaning of the desert, and how the nature changed for you after the dictatorship? And the desert means death, it means suffering, and the ocean means disappearance of and blood.
I say one
No, no, no.
Go ahead. Estaba esperando que diga algo y lo agarré. No dijo sangre. Okay. Okay. Sí, mi papá. I'll do my best. I'm not as keen. He's a professor. I'm a sculptor. Okay, señor. Pregunta el señor si cómo se sienten ustedes cuando ven estos programas de televisión como Caravana de la Muerte y el otro que los archivos, que cómo sienten la respuesta a su sentimiento, digamos, de ver estos programas de televisión.
O sea, los viví, ¿para qué los voy a ver?
Ya.
Es revivir, ¿no? Pero creo que es importante la población, nosotros mismos, recordemos que sucede que la mujer inseguridad, la televisión, aunque sea de tristeza, y de dolor nuevamente, hay cosas que se han olvidado a través de los años.
Her response directly was she does not see them. Why see them if you already lived it? And her response was more, I see them because I feel that it's important that the population knows and remembers what happened, you know.
para nosotros muy favorable, muy bueno, para los oyentes que todavía lo escriben, no tienen idea de esas cosas de
She says that it was very important for this program, these programs on TV, specifically because they would demonstrate and show things that people would never knew about. And so now it's something that comes out to light through the show. So, a través del programa la gente se da cuenta de muchas cosas que no.
y sobre todo la juventud de hoy aprendió a conocer lo que pasó en la historia de hace mucho tiempo atrás. Hoy ellos aprendieron que esa historia nunca contada.
Now the new generation is learning of that story that was never told through these programs. Sí, señor. Sí. Okay. So, traducir es okay. She says that it was also one other thing to consider was that it was very important that that other people, that la población en general en Calama pensaba que ustedes eran como nationally the people, some people would think that it was just them telling stories. And finally, when these programs started appearing, then even people from their city, Calama, would even go to their house and say, well, I finally understand that it is all true. It's not just something that you know, made up. Yeah.
La situación es la siguiente, es que pasó que en Calama fue la única parte en Chile que se les ocurrió poner fusilamiento en los certificados de defunción. Dice rompimiento, caja torácica, hemorragia y fusilamiento. Y en todo Chile dice rompimiento, caja torácica y nada más, o hemorragia,
Okay.
pero no dice fusilamiento, lo quiere en Calama, entonces esto salió a la luz por eso más que...
Fusilamiento. Fusilamiento. She says that also execution by fire. Firing squad. Yeah, she says that in Calama was the only place that they would, in the certificate of death, it would say, death by many things, but only in Calama they added at the bottom of the list execution by firing squad, and nowhere else. So that is another specific in Calama.
Y ahí algún periodista supo la noticia y corrió como río y empezaron a llegar periodistas de todo el mundo.
Okay. So now after all of this, then journalists found out, and then all of a sudden you had journalists from all over the world. Okay. No, no, no. Fine.
intentaban instalar a ver, ¿verdad? Pero no tenía la puede empezar, ¿no? Porque empezó a gritar, llorar, llorar, llorar. No puedo, y no estaba diciendo nada. Entonces esas cosas todas las sentí y es como que estaba en el momento.
Mm.
Era como que era, no sé,
So she would, for as far as these programs and movies, she would say, "Okay, now I'm going to sit down and do this and watch this," but she was never able to continue watching because she would just cry. And perdón lo que dijo de su hijo que llegaba y le decía
ellos me decían
que por qué lo estás mirando.
claro,
Ah.
ya yo le decía, lo vamos a ver para ir explicándole, contándole, pero
Ah.
no,
Ah, ok. Entonces a sus hijos le interesaba que usted le cuente la historia a través de ver el programa y usted no llegaba realmente. Okay. So like her son and her sons would want her to tell the story as they're watching these programs or movies, and she was never able to do so because of the pain, you know. Otra.
One more question, and then I'll close the mic.
Ujú. Pregunta cuántas personas todavía no han sido identificadas de los 26. Okay, so 7 of the 26 in this grave are unidentified, not yet identified. Mhm. Yeah, and maybe it's just a lost cause, you know. Maybe it will not happen, you know. So.
Thank you all for coming and spending your afternoon with us and hearing their stories. It's a tremendous honor for us to receive the Agrupación here at OU and to be able to present them with this award. I'm thinking about what they said about the fact that they're hoping that this award will help them to connect with other groups. But I'm also thinking about what it means to have our students here listening to these stories and hearing what happened, not because it's important, not only because it's important to know about what has happened elsewhere in the world, but to try to draw inspiration and to understand the kind of risk that these women have faced in the early months of the dictatorship, throughout the dictatorship, and since the great personal danger and the failure of support from their immediate community. And for all of us, I think, to draw inspiration that when we see injustices, when injustices are done, not only to us, but also to people around us, that we remember how important it is to speak the truth, to assure that the truth is spoken, and to be part of the process of reconciliation, which cannot happen without these kinds of witnesses and without the kind of depositions that these women are able to give us. So this is a very personal story, but it's also a story that all of us can draw something from as long as we find our common humanity.
So for the students who are in the room, this is an incredibly important opportunity for all of us to reflect on what our contributions are and how we're relating to these stories, but also to what happens around us in our immediate lives. So I want to thank all of you, remind you that the book is available out in the lobby, and I'm sure Paul Allen would be happy to sign the book if you would so like, and the women, of course, and to thank all of you again for your stories, and thank all of you for coming.
And thanks to our translators.
Yes, thank you very much for the translators.